Good afternoon. I'm Sonia Michelle, Director of United States Studies here at the Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion of a new book by Kate Masur, An Example for All the Land, Emancipation and the Struggle Over Equality in Washington, D.C. We're still waiting for one more of our panelists, but he's en route, and if he doesn't get lost in the building, we should have him shortly. Before I introduce our speakers, let me just briefly say something about the Wilson Center. For those of you who've been here before, you've heard my rap. I haven't changed it. The Wilson Center is a living memorial to President Wilson, and unlike the marble edifices that abound in this city, this one talks back and often has lots of interesting things to say. It's a place where scholars and policymakers come together to engage in dialogue and hopefully enlighten one another about the importance of what each of them is doing. And I think today's book and discussion is very much in the spirit of that because it is, although it's historical, it's about the city at a moment in its history when it was very much in turmoil, very much in flux, and in fact, many people thought that what happened here was so important that it would be, as Kate has said in her title, an example for all the land. This discussion is actually part of what has become a kind of series that we've developed sort of unintentionally, not Sex in the City, but Race in the City. We've done several books that have, this is the second in a series of discussions of books that address Washington, D.C., and particularly the issue of race. A few months ago, we did one on Blair Rubel's U Street. Blair is sitting back there. He's director of the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center, and he wrote a biography of U Street, and there's a copy of it outside if you want to take a look at it. This one is the second in the series, and next month we're going to be discussing Carla Peterson's new book, Black Gotham, which is about African Americans in New York City. So this is obviously both historians and contemporary scholars, and in the case of Carla, who's a literary scholar, it's a very fruitful subject, one that scholars are finding very fruitful as a way to think about cities as sites, as places where many, many different kinds of people come together in exciting ways, and where something that Kate has called local citizenship is struggled out. And she'll be talking, she and I assume her commentators will be talking about that in the next few minutes. This book, I think, really illustrates what one might think of as the magic of history. It shows how it is possible to go back and dig around in the archives and come up with documents and bring a city and a moment, a period in history to life. And I think Kate has done that very, very well in this book. She's used a wide array of sources, and when you page through the book, when you not only look at the illustrations but read the words, you really get a sense of what it was like to be alive in this very exciting moment in the history of Washington, D.C. At the same time, the book relies on a very deep historiography. Lots and lots of people have written, lots of historians have written about this period because it's such an important one in American history. And she's done that in a way that has allowed her to grasp both the intellectual debate that was going on, debates that were going on at this time, and also the political principles that were at stake. And again, we'll be talking about these in the next few minutes. We're very fortunate to have, Kate is a assistant professor at Northwestern University, where she teaches a wide range of courses pertaining to African American history. She's a professor of history and African American studies, and she teaches a wide range of courses, as you can see on the bio handout. She won a number of awards for this book while it was in process and when it actually came out. And now, with the assistance of yet another grant, she's at work on a new project, which is mentioned in her bio. As commentators, we're extremely fortunate to have with us three people who are going to elucidate very different aspects of this fine book. Speaking first will be Maurice Jackson, who is an associate professor of history at Georgetown University. Maurice has written on African American or about the intellectual history of African Americans abolitionism and the rise of the anti-slavery movement in the Atlantic world. In other words, he's taken a transnational approach to that, which is a very important and productive way of thinking about these issues. And he also is working on a book on Washington, D.C., a history of Washington, D.C., entitled D.C. Noir. And I'm sure we'll be hearing lots about that in the years ahead. Our second commentator, also from Georgetown University from the History Department, is Adam Rothman, who has also studied the history of slavery, African Americans, and other aspects of African American history. And he's going to be focusing more on the way that this period that Kate is discussing in the book fits into this sort of larger span of African American history. And finally, our missing, but hopefully soon to be arriving, commentator Jamin Raskin, who teaches law at American University, is also a sitting senator in the Maryland State Senate. So we're very fortunate that his legislative schedule allowed him to join us today. He'll be here shortly, and he'll be addressing some of the legal issues that emerge from this study. So we are delighted to have everybody with us here today, and I'm glad that you could all join us and that the weather did not interfere with all of that. We'll start out with Kate, who will talk about the book for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll hear from each of the commentators for about 12 or 15 minutes. Then we'll hear from you all with Q&A, and please join us afterwards for a reception. And the book will be available for signing and sale outside the door. So thanks again for coming. And Kate, the floor is yours. Do you need the book?
No.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Sonia. Am I mic'd? Am I? Okay.
Is it working?
Well, I bet you can hear me anyway. Okay. Ready? Okay. Thanks for inviting me, Sonia. It's really great to be here. I want to just recognize Sonia Michel for having been a really great mentor at a really important turning point in my career when I was thinking about where to go. I was living here for a long time and trying to decide where I was going to go next, and Sonia, who I knew from University of Maryland, was a wonderful support as I tried to make that decision. And I thank Adam and Maurice for being here, and Jamin Raskin, if he is here, when he is here, for being here and being interested in engaging with this work. So what I'm going to do is just talk fairly briefly about what I tried to do in this book. I'm going to talk about two threads. First, how this is meant to be an updated history of Washington during the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction. That's thread number one. And then number two, how the book is meant to reveal the importance of the debate over equality in the period after the end of slavery, or the period of slave emancipation. So first, on Washington. When I chose this project back in graduate school, I thought, my hypothesis was that Washington would be a good place to look at the commingling of quintessentially northern and southern issues in this period. Washington was southern in the sense that slavery existed here until 1862. It had a relatively large African American population, about 20% in 1860 and 33% by 1870. And these were consistent with southern patterns. And yet Washington in the Civil War era was also very influenced by Northerners. During the Civil War, a lot of Southern legislators and kind of Southerners left, right? They flat out left and went and did something else with their time for a while. And leaving the floor, leaving the space for Northerners to have an unprecedented influence on both local affairs and on national affairs. And so in a lot of ways on the ground in the city of Washington and also on the federal level, the northern influence was very significant. And so this mingling turned out that this hypothesis that I had bore out pretty well. And it was a rough guess, but it proved to be the germ of a project that began as a PhD thesis and resulted eventually, after many, many years, as a book. And I want to say that in the process of doing this research, I'm not going to be able to go into this very much today, but I really took pleasure, and Sonia kind of alluded to this, in finding amazing untold stories, just stories from the people who lived here, events that had never been written about, just interesting local trials or protests or political movements that nobody had really known about before. And so there was a lot of kind of pleasure in just discovering things that really hadn't been, that I hadn't known about, that historians or contemporaries, 20th and 21st century people haven't known. But Washington, as my PhD advisor always liked to remind me, Washington is also a problem for urban historians who have often been reluctant to study the city because it's so odd. Basically because it's a federal enclave. And so the perception is that there's not really anything that the study of Washington can tell us about anything else. It's just unique, it's bizarre. Who really cares? He always liked to ask me. Who cares? Who cares? So the more research I did, the more it became clear to me that if you look at the conjunction of the federal government, the local government, and street-level politics, Washington's Reconstruction history did have important things to say. Washington was a normal city in a lot of ways. A lot of things that happened here were similar to things that happened in other places. But in ways, in the ways that it wasn't normal, in the kind of overwhelming influence of Congress, in the ways that it was kind of a protectorate of the United States government, it also was extremely interesting, and it can tell us a lot. And so I think the burden of the book and the burden of anyone who really works on D.C. is to kind of explain both the city on its own terms, but also the larger significance. And I think there is quite a bit of larger significance in this city for our nation's history. So I want to kind of make 3 sub-points about this as D.C. history. First, one thing I emphasize in the book is the remarkable breadth of African-American activism in this period. It's fairly well known that antebellum Washington had a very well-organized, well-educated, free black community. The majority of African-Americans, on the eve of the Civil War, the majority of African-Americans in Washington were free rather than enslaved. And there were plenty of very well-educated women and men. There were strongly organized churches. There were private schools for black children. There were African Americans who worked in kind of servant-type positions for the federal government. But because they had those jobs, they knew the most powerful men in the country, and that helped them be able to get things done that they wanted to do. And those people were kind of poised to assume leadership roles in political leadership as the Civil War and Emancipation unfolded. Also, in this period, you have a huge influx of people who were escaping from slavery, primarily from Maryland and Virginia, who came into the district. Thousands and thousands of escapees from slavery came into Washington in search of freedom, in search of jobs, in search of family members. And so those people, the escaping slaves from the outlying area, formed another really important, not homogenous, but another, we can talk about them as another really important group that helped comprise the political culture of this period in Washington. And, hi, welcome. That's okay. The third group that we can talk about are northern migrants, who are African-American migrants from the north, who often came here to get involved in politics. And those people like John Mercer Langston, George Downing, Frederick Douglass himself, came here because they wanted to influence Congress, because they wanted to get involved in local affairs, because they saw this as a place where there would be great opportunities for them. And so you have this incredibly rich and very diverse group of, you don't even want to say group because it implies too much sort of coherence, but the African-American population here was very diverse and very deep and kind of poised to do really interesting things. So in the course of my research, it became clear to me that African-Americans were mobilizing in advance of policy changes. So they were pushing for fuller inclusion in the body politic and a broader vision of equality than most legislators, than white folks, who were willing, than they were willing to accept at first. So in the book, I call the claims that African Americans made in advance of the law upstart claims, to emphasize how they were uninvited, and yet they demanded notice. Beginning as slavery unraveled during the Civil War, so I'm talking about as early as 1861 and 1862, African Americans pressed for a panoply of new rights: equal access to the Capitol building itself, to streetcars, to the vote, and to hold office, for schools, public schools themselves, and in some cases for the integration of the schools. And Congress, in turn, often acted to fulfill the demands that they were making. Now, jumping ahead, so this black activism combined with the goodwill of Republicans in Congress led to black men's enfranchisement in 1867 and the transformation of the local city government. There was a short period of Republican control of city government. There was a mayor and a city council, and when the Republicans were in charge, they shifted policies dramatically. They implemented policies that were designed to employ poor people who were underemployed in the capital, namely ex-slaves, but not only ex-slaves, in public works projects. They passed local anti-discrimination legislation. So they really, really changed the shape of city government. So the second thread I want to follow is that the restructuring of the government in the District of Columbia in 1871 and 1874, that is when Congress turned D.C. into a territory in 71 and then to be governed by commissioners in 1874. And those of you who have been here and sort of know this history know that there was a commission form of government for the District of Columbia from 1874 into the 1970s. Okay, so that form of government that was established in 1874 lasted for close to a century. That transformation was part and parcel of what historians generally call the redemption of the District of Columbia. What I mean by that is that this the rise of a group of kind of improvers, Alexander Shepard is the most famous of them, and their ability to persuade Congress to change the shape of the government was actually not merely a group of well-meaning city fathers who just wanted to see development happen, but this was very much akin to what was going on throughout the South as moderate Republicans and Democrats mobilized together to overthrow the democratically elected Reconstruction governments. And so what I'm kind of emphasizing here is that the course of Washington's history was very, well, in some ways very Southern in terms of its redemption. And it's a little bit counterintuitive to the way that we've received the story of Alexander Shepard up until this point. I'm not going to go into the details of that because I feel like I need to move on, but we can certainly talk about that later. So by 1874, this is sort of a series of quick transitions, but by 1874, when Congress ends up replacing Shepard in the territorial government with a commission form, which is still less democratic, in fact, completely undemocratic in the sense that the people who govern the district are 3 commissioners appointed by the President of the United States, many Americans found this quite surprising and a little bit shocking. In a country that seems to be dedicated to the idea of local self-rule, the residents of the nation's capital couldn't even vote for their own elected officials. One of my favorite quotes about this is from George Spencer, who was a white Republican senator from Alabama. He's a carpetbagger, who argued that the permanent commission form of government threatened not only the voting rights of residents of the District of Columbia, but, quote, the franchise of the poor man throughout the United States, whatever his race, his color, his nationality, or his creed, and even forecast, quote, the abolishment of an elective government altogether. So what happened in D.C., the kind of quick transformation from D.C. being on the cusp of kind of progressive democratic changes to being on the cusp of disfranchisement really caught the attention of Americans. Okay, so third, and this is kind of implicit in what I've been saying, Washington was an example for all the land, right? Both in the early days that I write about, during the Civil War and immediately afterwards when Congress kind of was interested in going along with the expansive demands of African Americans and expanding the kind of rights and equality for not only African Americans, but there was a debate about women's voting rights in the Capitol, which I also write about. Going from being kind of on the vanguard of kind of expansive notions of equality to being on the vanguard of disfranchisement, a trend that would, only accelerate right in the South by the 1890s, and that was very much under discussion in the North as well, is quite remarkable, right? So that's where the notion of D.C. as an example for all the land comes in. And that quote, by the way, is from Charles Sumner, Senator Charles Sumner, who was very, very invested in the kind of progressive opening up democratic changes that were going on in D.C. at the time. Okay, so now I want to shift gears and talk about the debate over equality and a kind of what the book is trying to say about the debate over equality. My hope is that the book sets out a new framework for the study of the Civil War era by directing attention to a surprisingly neglected topic, and that is the struggle over equality. And I say over very advisedly. I don't talk about it as a struggle for equality. It's a struggle over equality. In recent decades, historians of slave emancipation have made the concept of freedom their principal analytical category. And certainly after slavery, the question of freedom's meanings, who wanted what kind of freedom, what did freedom mean to different groups of people, was absolutely central. Yet slavery's abolition also inaugurated a great debate over the future of equality in America. So moving beyond the familiar idea that people were either for equality or against it, right? It's not just yeah, I want it. No, I don't, because we don't know really what it is, right? What does it mean to favor equality, and what kind of policies would follow from that vision? The book tries to examine the era's competing visions of equality and inequality, and looks at who favored which kinds of equality in which places and for what reasons. Now, I talk about two threads of equality thinking. One is very familiar to all of us. It's the equal rights tradition, familiar from the French Revolution and the American Declaration of Independence, and that's the notion, right, that all individuals are entitled to the same rights, that there's a kind of individual equality that's a goal, may never, be realized, but it's always something to aspire to. And then, though, the second kind of equality I talk about is actually more of a tradition of inequality. And that is a belief that what mattered really was status in a community, that different people of different statuses, like let's say somebody who's a property holder compared to somebody who's not, or somebody who's a man compared to somebody who's not, or somebody who's white compared to somebody who's not, were entitled, in fact, to special rights and privileges. Now, many people have argued that that sort of tradition of inequality and status had largely been eclipsed by the middle of the 19th century, that this was a period of the rise of liberal individualism. But I found these discourses of inequality and status everywhere, and so I really wanted to bring those out to the surface. Of course, we most readily associate the language of status and inequality with conservative thinking. And to be sure, when people like Alexander Shepard argued for diminishing the political power of the voters in D.C., they did make claims for the special rights of taxpayers in the city. But African Americans also made claims in both idioms. For instance, when black Washingtonians claimed the right to vote, they insisted that, quote, the colored American citizens of D.C. were entitled to a government that derived its just powers from the consent of the governed. So that's a very kind of individualistic equality or kind of Declaration of Independence kind of talk. But that same voting rights petition went on to link the right to vote with African American status as taxpayers, as honest laborers, as soldiers, right? And that's the side of it that's talking about privileges. Like, see, we deserve the right to vote because we're doing all these things for the community. We have a certain kind of status, and that's why we should have, actually, they would call it the privilege of voting. So I found it really interesting that people spoke in both of these different kinds of languages, both when they were claiming rights and when they were taking away rights. Actually, people taking away rights didn't tend to speak in the language of the Declaration of Independence. Okay, you see this everywhere. I won't go into more examples, but this is here. This is present in a lot of places. Now, another sub-theme in the kind of equality stuff that I deal with is trying to untangle the knotty problem of what contemporaries meant when they talked about the categories of civil, political, and social equality. And this was something that really came out of the sources. It really intrigued me when people started saying, oh, well, you can have civil rights, but you can't have social equality. Well, what does that mean? And people seem to really be debating what that all meant. Generally speaking, Republicans, remember in this period, Republicans are the party of Lincoln, the party of Sumner, the party of African Americans, generally speaking, right? Republicans agreed that civil equality meant equal treatment by laws and implicitly security of property. And Republicans also tended to believe that all people should have formal equality before the law. But they distinguished between that kind of equality and political equality. So in other words, you could have civil rights, but that didn't mean you had a right to vote or a right to hold office or a right to be on a jury, right? So they kind of partitioned ways of thinking about equality. There was civil equality over here. That was an easy one for Republicans. They all kind of agreed on that. Civil equality for African Americans, civil equality for women for the most part. But political equality, they were a bit more divided on. You could have civil rights, but not necessarily be entitled to political rights. Here's where upstart claims came in. African Americans and some white radical Republicans insisted on a far more expansive vision of fundamental equality before the law. One that's familiar to us now, but was really unfamiliar at the time. They argued that civil equality should include the vote, which they saw as a fundamental civil right, whose origins, like the origins of other civil rights, were in natural law. And many also believed that the principle of civil equality required that African Americans must have equal access to public schools, streetcars, railroads, and other public accommodations, which didn't fall into the category of civil rights as they were conventionally understood. So in other words, there's a lot of disagreement about what are fundamental civil rights and what are not. Are your civil rights, do your civil rights include the right to vote or not? What is the status of privately run accommodations like restaurants or even streetcars? Do you have a right, do you have a civil right to equal access to those or not? These questions were not questions that they took for granted back then. They had to struggle over them. And the kind of bogey of all of this debate was the term social equality. Every time people sought to extend the realm of civil equality, the people who opposed it cried out, "No, you're demanding social equality." Unlike the terms civil equality and political equality, social equality had no actual content. It had no concrete existence. Instead, people used the term as a gloss for anything they saw as inappropriate government interference in whatever relationships they believed should properly be governed by personal taste. So, for example, Maryland Senator Reverdy Johnson argued in 1864 that a law forbidding discrimination on Washington's streetcars amounted to a social equality measure. Protection of African Americans' life and property was acceptable, he argued, alluding to civil rights or natural rights, but the government should not intervene in matters of, quote, political rights and social enjoyment. And he would see riding a streetcar as a matter of social enjoyment. And these matters, he said, had to do with the, quote, preference on our part for the society of those whom we deem God has created our equals. So in other words, we think that we decide who's our equal and we can choose who we want to hang around with. But not just in our dining room, but also on the streetcar, right? So the question is, how far does that realm of getting to decide who you want to be with extend? Another example, one conservative newspaper insisted that Congress should not give black men in the district the right to vote because the vote was a purely social question. Now, you know, that's kind of stunning. Like, how do you get from voting to social? I don't know. Well, actually, I do have some ideas about that. But so in other words, people would pull out the kind of bogey of social equality whenever they wanted to say, oh, no, you can't do that. Now, African American activists responded to these by saying often, we don't want social equality. We just want our rights in places that the government touches, in places that are regulated. And restaurants are regulated. Restaurants have licenses. Streetcars have licenses. Those are the places we're talking about. So they kind of backed off from saying they actually wanted social equality, but discussed why demanding access to certain kinds of places was not actually a demand for social equality. So I found opening up this world of debate over the meaning and kind of extent of equality to be really interesting and to have striking resonances for our own time. The notion is that the meaning of equality before the law could not be taken for granted in this period. And struggles to define equality before the law pivoted on the contested question of where the social or private domain stopped and where civil or public life began. Seeing the struggle over equality this way helps explain some puzzling kind of phenomena of the 19th century and to some extent the 20th. For example, why opening white schools to black children was more politically fraught than opening fancy restaurants and theaters to black patrons. It helps us understand how white Republicans in the early 70s could argue for racial equality while at the same time opposing independent black political organizations. And it sheds light on the crucial but slippery discourse of social equality, which Democrats and some Republicans used to stymie African Americans' post-emancipation claims to expansive racial equality. And that discourse of social equality became a key justification for racial segregation well into the 20th century. So it had a lasting impact. So I'm going to stop there with that sort of outline, and I'll be happy to kind of follow up on anything that I said in Q&A. Okay, thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate.
Thank you for having me. I came to Washington in the mid-'70s. Just as Home Rule was developing. I had been a statehood delegate in the 1980s. I had been an advisor neighborhood commission in the 1990s. So this book, for people like me, has many different callings. I should say, while Mr. Raskin is here, that when I first came to Washington, I lived at 1831 Wyoming Avenue as a young man. He was a young boy. I haven't seen him since. He doesn't remember me, but I remember you very well. Nice to see you. It comes from having one of these strange memories. Kate Masur poses some challenging problems for Washingtonians, for all those interested in the nature of democracy and democratic changes. The most fundamental of these are philosophical, political, and moral. It is the link between freedom and equality, the link between freedom and the right to be seen as a human being, the later link between freedom and the right to vote, and between freedom and the right to hold office and to attend schools, integrated schools as equals. Like all questions, this has an offshoot of one place earlier in the 18th century, where I work mostly. It is between freedom and humanity. Did freedom equate with being accepted as a member of human society or humanity? The early anti-slavery leaders skirted on this issue, going back to the society propagation of the gospel, and even the early Quakers. Said one Quaker leader, John Woolman, "The blacks seem far from being our kinfolk. They are vile stock." Said the British anti-slavery leader, Granville Sharp, "I am not apt to see them as men." Is this any different than what Abraham Lincoln said some years later, in 1862? "There must be a position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favor of the superior position assigned to the white race." So in the 18th century, few people, a few like Anthony Benezet, challenged this. In the 19th century, few really challenged it. Some, like John Brown, and as we're told, Charles Sumter, went to the mat on this, challenging these social and political justifications for the inequality. In addition to looking at these questions, Kate Masur hits on the practical ones, and that is one that goes back and forth. How would white people respond when they saw blacks who wanted to fight for their own freedom and insist on not just fighting for that freedom, but to equally fight for that? In essence, they did not want freedom given to them. They wanted to fight for it. They wanted the right to fight, just as blacks did in the Second War. And the questions raised themselves again. And they raised themselves again as Congress took away those rights they fought for in the 1870s and took them away until the 1970s, and then again with limited home rule. The roots of much of this goes back to the 1820s, when Congress first began passing laws setting regulations against blacks. They set regulations in black codes, and even the abolitionists wrote that blacks should be pious, to train their children for suitable employment, to save their money, to pay their debts, to avoid alcohol consumption, and to abstain from licentiousness. However, free blacks nonetheless had a strong presence in Washington and fought for their rights. As early as 1806, public schools led by people like Moses Liverpool, George Ball, Nicholas Franklin, started schools. A man named Earl Mont, a Muslim, earned enough to earn his own freedom. Another woman in 1810, Althea Turner, bought her freedom. And others like Tobias Henson bought their freedom and earned enough to purchase that of their relatives. There had long been this history that Kate Masur talks about leading up to the Reconstruction period. And then in the churches, it became very important. The African-American church founded in Philadelphia by Absalom Jones and Richard Allen. These were two men who left the Philadelphia church when a white man tapped on their shoulder and told them they would have to go to the rear. And instead of going to the rear, they kept on the way out. This thing happened again in the 1820s in black churches, as blacks founded Ebenezer Methodist Church and later the Israel Baptist Church, with John Cook Sr. founding this. And again, this black church played a later role as men like Henry McNeil Turner, head of the Israel AME Church in 1862 and 1863, did what Allen and Jones had done and mobilized black people. In this case, they mobilized black people to fight in the war. And they did what Douglass said, to extend the hand of mercy to bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh, in essence, to fight for their own freedom. And tensions kept arising in this place called Washington. There rose after Nat Turner's rebellion, when there was something called the Snow Riots. And the Snow Riots occurred for many reasons, but also when white ship carpenters went on strike, and they expected the blacks to strike with them. But the blacks had no reason to strike. They had no rights. And this goes back to something that Kate Masur points out many years later, a strike led by blacks, led by George Haddon in 1871. And the whites refused to aid them, but they wanted the blacks to aid them in an earlier period. And so this book gives us many, many examples of those many dilemmas. Now, it's very interesting that in the Snow Riots, the attorney for that was none other than Francis Scott Key, the author of this great song that we sing every day. Later, at the Pearl Incident in 1848, where again the struggle for free blacks came out, the attorney general who prosecuted them was his son. At the same period in 1848, we saw the recognition of many things happening in Europe, the revolutionary uprisings, the debates, the sectional conflict, and they took place again in Washington. Around this time, a young congressman came. At the 30th Congress, his name, Abraham Lincoln. He stayed from March 1847 to March 1849, representing Illinois. He witnessed many incidents around the Pearl matter. And he brought up for the first time something that Kate talked about then and later, about compensating the end to slavery, compensating emancipation. But Lincoln did not, when he brought the bill up, he couldn't get anywhere. And he said, I dropped the matter knowing that it was useless to prosecute the business at that time. But black Washingtons did not become dismayed. They kept moving, kept fighting as they moved about Washington. Those people that she mentioned, like John Cook and Anthony Bowen and Henry Turner, as they mobilized for their own freedom. At one point, Turner declared, the cry has been long. Give us the opportunity. Show us a chance to climb to distinction. And we will show the world by our bravery what the Negro can do. And then, as soon as we invite to stand on such a basis as we'll develop their interior qualities for us to divide the idea and scornfully turn away, would be to argue a self-consciousness of incapacity. And they fought and they fought, and they brought other people such as Martin Delany and others along. Men like Turner served bravely in the United States Colored Infantry. And he called this the mother of all Negro troops. And he pleaded for Lincoln to mobilize more. High points came in this struggle as black and whites fought to aid refugees. And as many as 50,000 moved across the line. We called them during this period. And Frederick Douglass at the time wrote to his great friend we were told about, Charles Sumner, I want only a moment of your time to give you thanks for your speech in the Senate for the bill on the abolition of slavery, because Sumner had the audacity, the nerve to keep fighting for the blacks. And he ended his speech, Sir, I rejoice you. And it continued, until one day Abraham Lincoln, who had called Washington in 1837 a sort of Negro stable, signed the Emancipation Act of April 16, 1862. And he said to Horace Greeley at the time, I'm a little uneasy about the abolishment of slavery in this district, but I would be glad to see it abolished. But as to the time and manner of doing it, it may not be right, Lincoln said. But nonetheless, he did it. And he moved to compensate those slave owners at the time. Congress soon established the Freedom Relief Association and established many organizations which were the forerunners of the Freedmen's Bureau. Lincoln signed the Second Confiscation Act on July 17th, and on August 14th, a human Washington Day, some months after D.C. emancipation, he met at the White House with the district's black leaders, urging them to colonize. And Kate Masur points out something very important in this, because you see, black leaders went to Lincoln, and they said, and it's worthy of note, especially in Washington, D.C., that has such fissures between the, quote, elite and non-elite. For the first time I remember ever, the elite of Washington said they would pay attention, the black elite, to the ideas of the masses. And so they went, and Lincoln offered them a chance to colonize, to send them away, and they rejected his appeal. But yet this so infuriated black leaders that Douglass and others refused to continue to recruit soldiers for the war. With the adoption for the 14th Amendment in 1866, ratified in 1868, African Americans were guaranteed citizenship, and the Dred Scott decision was ruled null and void. The first civil rights in the United States guaranteed equal rights were passed over Johnson's veto. Congress debated whether the right to vote would be granted to the black male citizens. As whites in D.C. passed a referendum denying blacks that right, even after Congress fought for that. Nonetheless, the struggle continued. On April 16, 1866, residents held the first of 35 annual celebrations of D.C. emancipation. These days offered African Americans in the nation's capital and the entire nation a chance to celebrate their freedom, their rights to vote, and express their concern about the hopes in the future. While the Garrisonians, ex-followers, believed that the 13th Amendment and the abolition of slavery meant that all goals had been met, Douglass and Sumner disagreed. And Douglass wrote, around this time, the Negro is not abolished as a degraded class. Thank you.
Sonia, thanks for inviting me to comment on an example for all the land. Kate's book is impressively researched and sharply argued, and it uncovers a roiling world of political unrest and upheaval in the wake of emancipation, in the shadow of the Civil War, and then in the context of Reconstruction. Sonia, I like, Sonia, your phrase of the magic of history. There is a certain kind of magic to this book in the reanimation of old ideas, making dead documents come alive again. And that really is a remarkable achievement. But history is not just magical, it's very dirty. It's very gritty. And I think one of the achievements of this book is to show how the daily struggles of people who had just emerged into freedom in the face of tremendous pressure shaped national debates about what would come after slavery. In my time, I just want to elaborate on a few of the ideas that form the backbone of this book, and in some respects I'll be building on the description that Kate's already given, and also the sort of the prehistory of the struggles for freedom and equality that Maurice has discussed as well. The first point has to do with Washington, D.C. as a location for this kind of study, the significance of Washington, its exemplary status. Washington is important for three reasons. First, the uncontested quality of federal jurisdiction over the district. That meant that Congress was immediately involved in the fate of liberty there. And as Maurice points out, this had gone back a long way. Abolitionists had held up Washington, D.C. as an example of hypocrisy in the slaveholders' republic, all the way through the Civil War, challenging the spectacle, the horrible spectacle, for instance, of the slave trade in the district. Slaves in chains being marched within sight of the Capitol, kind of a 19th century precursor to the arguments today about the high rates of infant mortality just blocks away from the national capital. So Congress had jurisdiction in ways that it didn't necessarily have in the southern states. Secondly, Washington represented the nation. It was a spatial representation of the nation. The nation was on display in Washington in ways that it wasn't in other places, and that raised the stakes of what went on in Washington, both for a domestic audience as well as foreign observers. But of course, at the same time as Washington was an exemplary space, it was also a contradictory space. From the very early days of the Republic, what was this federal territory? What did it mean for a territory to be federal? And what did it mean to have a capital city in a place where concentrations of power were mistrusted, were in bad odor? And the final reason why Washington, D.C. is so important for this particular history is the proximity of the local black population to the seat of power, the place that the abolitionist James McCune Smith called the high places where his chains were forged. It was a quotation from the book, which I really like. That proximity of a local and politically active black population made a tremendous difference, I think, both to the local politics of emancipation in the district and the way that national debates were conducted. And that makes Washington a really good place and a really important place to study. So what does this study show? First, it demonstrates the significance of what Kate calls upstart claims. Black people claiming rights in advance of law and policy, imagining a status for themselves that most other, especially white Americans, not only couldn't imagine, but they couldn't fathom it. It was beyond anything they had dreamed of, even in their nightmares. And I think the way that Kate develops this idea of upstart claims is an advance in what historians refer to as the study of black agency. She's not claiming here that African Americans in D.C. had power or that they accomplished all of these things by themselves, but they inserted themselves into a complex political process in effective ways. They put themselves on the political map. And the question I have here, and I think one thing we can discuss further, is how freed people got all these ideas in their heads. Where did these ideas come from? We've heard some ideas already. The free people of color, the population of free people of color who was already in D.C. on the eve of emancipation, some of whom had remarkably cosmopolitan backgrounds, being educated in Europe, for instance, having traveled abroad. The dense civic associations that black people themselves formed in Washington and throughout the nation, churches, Masonic lodges, schools for themselves, but also some new institutions that emerged during the war, including, most importantly, the Union Army as an educational institution for black people themselves, and the Republican Party, which mobilized black people formally in the political process for the first time. And the other important point here, I think, is that Kate demonstrates that there were debates within the black community, that black people in D.C. were not a monolithic, homogeneous political mind. They argued among themselves about ideas and tactics and strategy. I think that's also an important contribution. I want to split apart the idea of equality that Kate presents into the idea of citizenship on the one hand and democracy on the other. Obviously, they're connected, but I think we can separate them. Kate's told us that, and I think this is correct, that many Americans in the middle of the 19th century distinguished between civil or natural rights, political rights, and social rights. And those distinctions created a formidable obstacle to the extension of equality in all realms of life to the freed people. And I want to highlight two problems that freed people faced in their attempt to expand the sphere of citizenship. The first is the argument that black people didn't have the level of civilization necessary to be proper citizens. Now, there was an outright racist form of this that was rooted in a concept of biology, just biologically not fit to be free people, to be free citizens. But there was another concept as well. And the important thing is that this concept of black people's lack of civilization was one shared by many anti-slavery types and abolitionists. And that was the idea that slavery itself had damaged black people, so that coming out of slavery, they were not yet fit for freedom. They could be, but they needed to be trained. This was a common idea, not just in the United States, but throughout slave societies of the Atlantic world. And that's why you see all sorts of intermediate positions between slavery and freedom being fashioned by abolitionists themselves. In the British case, this took the form of a period of apprenticeship. So this middle position, this intermediate phase between slavery and freedom, was common to most post-slave societies. And the other main obstacle to the expansion of equality to all spheres of life, as Kate has mentioned, is the defense of private liberty. The idea that there are some spheres of life that the government, no matter how well-intentioned it is, just should keep its hands out of. Like, it shouldn't tell us who to have dinner with or who to marry. And that was another formidable obstacle to the expansion of the rights for freed people. So they had to fight against these ideas to become citizens. And finally, I just want to touch on the issue of democracy. The issue raised by the extension of suffrage to black men in the district and ultimately in the 15th Amendment to black men in the nation as a whole. The problem for D.C. Is the problem of home rule. And there's a paradox here, because initially the extension of rights, the extension of freedom and then certain kinds of rights to black people in D.C. was really imposed by Congress, imposed from above against the wishes of the local citizenry, which at that moment was white and largely associated with the Democratic Party. So emancipation came from above, even as black people agitated for it from below. And it was very short-lived, democracy in the district. It's really remarkable how short-lived it was. Within a decade, Congress had yanked power back from the district. Congress gave and Congress took away. Thinking about Washington in a broader Southern context, there's a clear juxtaposition here. In Washington, redemption came at the hands of the Republican Party itself and was achieved by abolishing local democracy. It was abolishing home rule. But in the rest of the South, it was in a sense the opposite. In the rest of the South, it was the Democrats, through campaigns of terror, seizing back the local state governments from federal authority. So it seems like what happens in D.C. is almost the reverse of what happens everywhere else in the South. But what connects them is this. In D.C. and the rest of the South, and even in places in the North as well, what was going on was a tremendous backlash against white male suffrage, against the fully fledged democracy of the mid-19th century. This had actually begun before the Civil War in attacks on the voting rights of immigrants. But it proliferates after the war in a backlash against the enfranchisement of black people, and also in the North and the West, attacks against urban machines and their alliances with immigrants. And the way and really it takes the form of a bourgeois taxpayers' revolt almost everywhere. In the South and in D.C., it has this, as Kate points out, this racialized tinge where the argument against black suffrage becomes an incredibly powerful cudgel with which to pummel democracy back into its place. And the final point I want to make is that this could be interpreted not just as a local or national question, but an international one as well. In places, in Example for All the Land, you see allusions to white Democrats' fears of D.C. becoming another Haiti. And specifically in the 1871 general strike, which is prominently featured at a strategic moment in this history, the strikers are compared to the communards of Paris in the same year. And I think what I want to suggest ultimately is that this is not just a local story about Washington, D.C., but it has connections and is integrated into a much broader story about the contests over freedom and equality, race and class in an Atlantic world as a whole. So, well done, Kate.
Thank you, Adam.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I was going to say that Maurice and Adam took nearly everything that I wanted to say, and with your last point, Adam, I can say you took everything I wanted to say. But I'm going to try to develop the point that you closed with. I I should say when I had the chance to read this wonderful book over the weekend, I was reading it basically like the newspaper. It had kind of the freshness and the immediacy and the aliveness of well, actually what newspapers used to be like back in the day. In fact, it struck me as much more relevant and contemporary than the actual Sunday Washington Post, which was your main rival for my attention this weekend, Kate. Yeah, I kept thinking about William Faulkner, who said the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. An example for all the land. I think that the author proves her point that Washington, D.C. has acted like a barometer of the national political will. I mean, it's kind of a test tube for the state of American politics. I hope in the sequels we'll get the stories of the progressive political ferment and creativity that took place in Washington at the time of the New Deal, where also Washington came alive again, or during the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s, when the district again became the destination for an influx of progressive African Americans coming from around the country that became the basis for modern home rule in the careers of many people that people in this room will know. I think that what took place during the Reconstruction period set the template for what the progressive incarnation would look like. You get a deeply mobilized and politicized local population that is committed to local democracy, meaning actual participatory institutions where people present themselves, also voting rights in local representative structures, also importantly the right to marry, which plays a role also in Kate's book in terms of former slaves who wanted recognition of relationships that they had before the end of the Civil War and wanted their marriages or common law marriages to be validated. Local control over public schools with close community involvement and progressive education, and then equality in public accommodations and equality and integration in public accommodations like streetcars or buses or what have you. Now, the converse of all of this is true in terms of the redemption period or the long stretches of conservative rule that punctuate these moments of democratic ferment in the District of Columbia. So with the end of the Reconstruction experiment, the redemption with the commissioner form of government, we see a retraction of voting rights, which certainly disrupts the conventional Whiggish narrative of a constantly enlarging franchise in American history. It's not like that. It's much more like a seesaw. And an assault on local democracy and local representative political structures. And, of course, the creation of Jim Crow. So when I was growing up, Maurice, on Wyoming Avenue, as your neighbor, I remember very clearly segregated places in the 1960s. And in fact, I've been on the front page of the Washington Post just once. Actually, I've been on the front page of the Metro section recently. But I was on the front page of the Washington Post when I was 2 years old, carrying a picket sign telling, I think, Woolworths to integrate, to desegregate in Washington, D.C. So it really was very much a southern city a century later after the end of the Reconstruction experiment. You know, and you can follow the analogy through to our own times where the district, you know, goes from an energized, expansive kind of home rule conception to the Financial Control Board and congressional meddling and interference on a whole range of issues from gay rights to medical marijuana to you name it, the public education, vouchers, and so on. So an example of all the land, a barometer of the national political will. And so I return to what Adam called the paradox of the District of Columbia, which was exactly the word that occurred to me as well. When the movement for strong states' rights which is the language of conservatism in America, surges in the country, that's the moment when local democracy is at its greatest peril in the District of Columbia. When you have movements for strong federal power and intervention, that's the moment when local democracy gets its strength, gets its vigor in the District of Columbia. Now today, of course, the macro struggle or conflict is over the question of full representation. And it got me thinking about the difference between democracy and representation, because I think that the question that's raised today by this book is whether the community of people who live in D.C. can get the benefits of being the national political laboratory and test tube and also have real representation or not. I mean, it may be that it's a choice between the two, that either the population can gamble, and obviously it remains an extremely progressive city and progressive community, in some sense probably the most progressive city in the country in some ways, is certainly one of the top 2 or 3, but does it want to continue to gamble on the state of national politics, even when you have the equivalent of the radical Republicans in power, which would say are the progressive Democrats, Obama and majorities in the House and Senate, where the district is basically left alone, but you don't get a tremendous investment in the district, and you certainly don't get the voting rights and representation that people want. Is it better to gamble on that and to say, let's continue to have a direct relationship with the federal government unfiltered by a state political structure, which can either be a threat to people's human rights, as we've seen throughout American history, or it can be a defense of those rights against an intrusive, violating federal government, right? Or does the district want to move into a different direction? I mean, in other words, does the community want to somehow negotiate a political exodus from this traditional relationship with Congress, either through independent statehood or reunion with Maryland or some other choice? And it may be that ultimately the people living in D.C. are not going to be able to have the benefits of direct democracy and whatever goes with the chance of progressive federal government coming in, and also have complete political equality, first-class citizenship in the national sense. It might be a choice between the two. Thanks very much.